You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. President Biden's first couple of years in office were met with significant events, from signing a $1.9 trillion COVID-19 pandemic relief bill to committing billions of dollars to support Ukraine in its ongoing war with Russia. Work is moving ahead, but these other challenges shifted focus away from the infrastructure agenda. Biden campaigned on fixing America's roads and bridges, modernizing the energy grid by transitioning to clean technology, and spurring trade by strengthening international supply chains. But that will take decades to fully implement, so the administration has set its sights on more attainable, immediate goals. In recent years, electric vehicles have been widely adopted by American car manufacturers, and EVs are expected to be 1/5 of new cars on U.S. roadways in 2023. For U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, EVs are both a pathway to helping solve climate change and for fostering greater economic cooperation. A couple of weeks ago, he was in Detroit, Michigan, for the 2023 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Ministerial Meeting on Transportation. With 21 member economies in attendance, Secretary Buttigieg led high-level dialogue on the administration's priorities and made the case for why it's time sustainability rises to the top of the agenda. I asked him to reflect on the APEC meetings and how these high-level conversations reach everyday Americans. Secretary Buttigieg, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
A lot of the countries in APEC are our partners and friends, and at the same time, our competitors to perfect many of these technologies that we've been talking about. How do you handle that juxtaposition? These are places that would love to beat us and beat us soundly on the next big breakthrough in batteries, on the next big breakthrough in light rail. They want to make the cars for rapid transit systems and deny American makers the contracts. And yet, you sit around a table and you talk about a cooperative future. How do you do that?
Well, it starts with honesty, even if it's a little awkward. So at the most recent APEC event, I was chairing a meeting at a table with 21 economies representing 60% of the world's GDP. And whether it was talking about our commitments on sustainability and equity in front of China, or talking about our very strong views on the destruction to supply chains and transportation that was wreaked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, while Russia is at that table. It requires being ready to just state plain truths. And of course, that led to a vigorous reaction from the representatives of Russia and of China. But alongside that honest conversation, we also see, as you're hearing from all of these economies, from Papua New Guinea talking about their very real stakes and that of all the Pacific Islands in beating climate, to Japan presenting their intention to have prototyped an ammonia-driven ship and then a hydrogen-driven ship in 2026 and 2027, respectively, that could really affect the sustainability of the maritime sector. What you see is that all of these economies have a level of vulnerability to the harms of climate change and the harms of not getting supply chains right. And some activities where it makes sense for us to be in communication, even if we're in ferocious competition in other areas. We are not representing the same countries or serving the same peoples, but we're living on the same planet. And that means there are certain things where we really do have to recognize a shared fate. And forums like these, I think, are an important place to make that clear and to find where there is scope for cooperation, even alongside fierce competition.
You are now a Michigander. The meetings have been going on in Detroit, freighted with symbolism. What does the trajectory of Detroit tell us about the job ahead?
You have to say probably my favorite part of the experience of having these 21 economies gathered in Detroit was sharing what Detroit means and explaining to representatives from Indonesia or Peru what the arc of Detroit's story tells us, because you have a community, and at a smaller scale, my hometown of South Bend, where I grew up, lived this. And it's true all across the state that I married into, Michigan, and all across the industrial Midwest. You had the rise of middle class fueled by innovation and fueled by the good-paying jobs that come with forward-looking industry, followed by the pain that came with the loss of those jobs, to the point that whole neighborhoods, whole communities, even whole cities were given up for dead. And that was certainly true in Detroit, which lost something like 2/3 of its population. And yet, you walk around downtown Detroit now, and you see not just economic growth, but signs of a kind of, I would almost call it a municipal patriotism, a kind of a militant pride, precisely because it had been so hard across the so-called Rust Belt. Communities from South Bend to Detroit to Grand Rapids and others have, I think, come to embrace the ways in which we got weathered by those experiences and carry that with us into a determination to succeed and win in the next round of transformation. And there's no question that the transformations coming to our economies are no less consequential than the arrival of the automotive era. And Detroit, for that reason, was a perfect backdrop to be discussing our shared imperatives around climate change, around sustainability, around inequality that might touch very differently in Singapore than they do in Canada, but still deserve to be on a shared agenda.
It's been 2 years, 4 months since you got the job, a pretty consequential couple of years in the life of the country. What's tangible? What's visible? What can be seen that's happened along the way in your brief?
Well, what can be seen now is a lot of construction starting to happen. Here's the way I think of the arc of our 4 years, and we're now well into the third. Year one, most of our efforts were concentrated around getting that infrastructure law passed. This is something that a big infrastructure deal that had escaped president after president, Congress after Congress. The last president made a lot of noise about delivering one of these and couldn't. We spent that first year getting the bill signed. President signed it in November of his first year in office. And then year two was about standing up all of the programs that it created. 46 novel programs in the Department of Transportation alone, some of which are multi-billion-dollar efforts to do things we've never done before, like support a nationwide network of EV chargers or invest in communities building resilient infrastructure faced with the climate future that is coming their way and going to affect their roads, as well as more traditional programs that got redesigned or grown. So if year one was passing the bill and year two was launching the programs, years 3 and 4 are really about the money moving and the dirt flying. It's early days still in terms of the physical construction getting underway, but it's starting to happen on very big projects like the Portal North Bridge that is a key link in the Northeast Corridor, and smaller projects that mean everything to the communities where they're happening. So that's the biggest area in terms of what's physically happening. Then there's another area I would point to where there's been a lot of work, and that's the other very important part of our mission as a department. If part of what we do is build good things well, another part of what we do, the most important in fact, is to protect everyone who comes into contact with any of our transportation systems. From a passenger in a car protected by the way that we regulate those cars to make them safer, to a family whose home is in the path of a projected highway expansion, making sure their voice is heard before that house is turned down, to an airline passenger. And compared to just 1 year ago, there are dramatically more enforceable passenger protections for things like getting a meal or ground transportation or rebooking or a hotel if an airline is responsible for you getting stuck. So that may not show up in terms of the physical benefits that you see with the infrastructure construction we're doing, but just as important, I think, and just as much of an impact on everyday life, especially in the safety side, where the most important outcomes actually are things people don't notice: the crash that doesn't happen, the family that doesn't suffer. And that's always been the bedrock mission of the Department of Transportation.
One of the most familiar photographs of early 2021 was of container ships out in the open ocean, not moving. Did you have to sort of quickly go to school on how stuff gets around and how those containers get off of those ships?
You know, it was amazing to see the term supply chains go from something that you would hear maybe in the business world or in this building, but not exactly a kitchen table term, suddenly become something everybody in the country was talking about. The public had it on their mind. The president had it on his mind. And we had to take a number of steps as a department to help deal with that. And that's just one example of how the COVID pandemic led to, I would argue, the most severe and multifaceted set of disruptions to U.S. transportation since 9/11. We saw that in a number of different areas. We certainly saw it in container shipping. Now, before those ships were in those news stories, we saw that there were issues and we were getting on it. In September, October, you saw those news stories. But by July, I had convened the port directors and other players in the space because we could see that there was going to be this challenge. And working together, we were able to get through it. Matter of fact, that same winter, that same Christmas that some of the news stories said might be canceled, we actually saw an all-time record high in terms of the movement of goods in this country. But it happened in a way that obviously wasn't as smooth as it needs to be, and it surfaced issues, not just short-term issues because of COVID, but long-term issues about the capacity and the fluidity of our supply chains. Yes, the ports, but not only the ports, warehouses, railroads, trucking. And through these years, we have been working to make sure each part of those supply chain links becomes stronger. The supply chains themselves are typically in private and or local hands, but they run on public infrastructure, where steps that we take, like our port infrastructure grants to expand port capacity, or our highway improvements, not just to build better roads, but to add more parking for truck drivers, which is a huge quality of life issue, which is one of the reasons we're losing truck drivers, all add up into what should be a stronger, better supply chain for whatever the next shock to the system will be. Hopefully not a global pandemic, but we know there will be something. There's always something that affects the movement of goods in this country and around the world.
Layer on the peculiarity and the challenges of COVID time, the invasion of Ukraine, which brought tumult in energy markets, expensive gas, high inflation. When you need to bring people along for decarbonization, you're a policymaker. On one level, this is sort of an object lesson. But on another level, like, you might argue that it makes people risk averse. That when you tell them, well, here, in the face of this, we have to do something that's big, that's hard, that's expensive, and it has to take a long time. Did it help with buy-in? Did it hurt with buy-in? This particular peculiar time of high gas prices, of high natural gas prices, of people worried about the future rather than trying to make it better. What challenges does it give you as a guy who's trying to sell decarbonization to a sometimes skeptical American public?
Well, I think anytime there's a disruption or a shock, there's a natural instinct to retreat to a more familiar and safer place. But the challenge we have is to make clear that we will be more vulnerable to the next shock, a pandemic, a war, whatever it might be, if we don't take care of the basics. And it turns out that in our time, taking care of the basics includes making sure we have a more sustainable, smarter, more resilient way to, for example, power our transportation systems. I'll give you another example that comes to mind. I saw for myself the effect of the hurricane in Florida. And one of the questions that was raised at the time was, well, there are power outages down there. Well, doesn't that mean that electric vehicles will put us at a disadvantage in these disaster zones? Actually, what we saw happening was that for that very small sliver of people who had access to electric vehicles, some of them were able to use the generative capacity of those as a backstop during a time when it's also, of course, just as difficult to get liquid fuel to a disaster area as it is to get electrons there. So the bottom line is that we need to make sure that we are better positioned to weather whatever is coming our way. And part of that is to have more domestic clean energy production. Energy is a little bit outside my portfolio, but of course the crossover between how we get around and how we power how we get around is hugely important. And by the way, it's a real challenge. So sometimes you will hear with something like electric vehicles, you will hear the problems with sources for batteries and critical minerals, or the problems with getting our grid ready, used as an excuse to just stick with the status quo. The status quo is not an option. But that doesn't mean those problems aren't real. And we're hard at work, teaming up with the Department of Energy, by the way, to bring more sourcing of the raw materials and their refinement for EV components, for example, back to either onshore, nearshore, or friendshore, which is my new favorite word, those critical supply chains. Same thing with our grid. It's absolutely true that we cannot run tomorrow's vehicles on yesterday's grid. The solution to that is not to trap everybody in yesterday's vehicles. It's to build tomorrow's grid. And that's exactly what our colleagues over at the Department of Energy are doing. So yes, the uncertainty in the world will remind us of how vulnerable we are. The answer is not to cling to whatever we inherited and hope it'll last us longer than it should. The answer is to put ourselves in a better position.
But things were less than ideal when trying to get everybody to make that transition. People are keeping their old vehicles longer. Cars are getting more expensive. There's range anxiety, which I'm sure, like supply chain, is one of those phrases that people are using more regularly in their daily conversations. And let's face it, the internal combustion engine had a 100-year start, whether it's a network of Jiffy Lubes or gas stations or parts stores or whatever, getting us to that next place at a time when people are not so sure about the future. It's hard.
This is the biggest transition in the automotive sector since the internal combustion engine itself. Although I should point out, as a son of South Bend, Indiana, home of the Studebaker Car Company, where you can go to the museum and see the first models from 1903, 1904, and 1908, in the very earliest years of the 20th century, companies like Studebaker and the Big Three, what became the Big Three in Detroit, started out electric. And then for a number of reasons, and it really could have gone either way, for a number of reasons it wound up being fossil. And so in an interesting way, this is a return to a path that might have been taken 100 years ago. But yes, of course, this is a big, tough transition. And our approach is not to push anybody into an electric vehicle before they are ready. Our approach is to make it easier and more affordable to choose to be in an electric vehicle for families and drivers that stand to gain a lot. And by the way, the families and drivers who stand to gain the most are maybe a little different than what people would assume, because early adopters of EVs was something that was coded and viewed as well-off, liberal, urban, coastal people. But if you think about it for a minute, the more you drive in a day, so the more you live in a rural area, the longer distances you cover routinely, the more money you're going to save, because filling up on electric is cheaper than filling up on gas or diesel. Not only that, but if you live in a suburban or exurban or rural area, you're actually more likely to be in a single-family home, which means you're more likely to have the ability to plug your car in to the wall. You already have charging infrastructure, whether you know it or not. It's the plug in your wall. There are more advanced forms of charging infrastructure, but right now in our garage in Michigan, our hybrid minivan that we got after becoming parents plugs right into a regular wall plug. So there's a lot we have to do just to demystify electric vehicles, but most importantly, to make them more affordable. That's what the Inflation Reduction Act does. It literally cuts thousands of dollars off the price of domestic electric vehicles, including used ones. And that's an important part of what we have to do going forward too. Then we have the charging side, establishing a charging network across the country, making sure that in the harder to charge places, which are actually the multifamily dwellings in urban neighborhoods that are not wealthy, where it's not yet profitable for a company to put one in, that we help accelerate that process. And that's exactly what we're doing with the charging infrastructure program that over 5 years is going to put $7.5 billion into making sure that Americans can confidently set out on a road trip. In the same way right now, there's going to be a gas station where you need it. Know that you'll be able to charge up too.
I worry about us becoming the can't-do nation. I went to my first news conference as a reporter to unveil a high-speed rail project in 1984 with the Secretary of Transportation, the governor, local mayors. It was a big deal. Southern California, this was the future.
And people hated sitting on the I-5, driving much of the day to get from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And here we are, 39 years later. It's sort of built into the middle of nowhere and building out from the bottom, but it's not there. You can't do it yet. Are we burdened by our dazzlingly successful past? Have we been dining out so long on our successes of the 19th and 20th century that we just can't imagine doing these big things anymore?
When you inherit a legacy system, setting up something new can be harder, in the same ways that it was actually in developing countries that you saw some of the most creative uses of cell phones for mobile payments, for example, in ways that we only caught up to a few years ago. If we had no transportation systems at all and we're designing on a clean sheet, we'd probably come up with a tidier and more kind of 21st century ready mix of roads, rail, transit. But of course, it doesn't work that way. But you can adapt. I spent a couple of years as a student in England, where the cities there have very odd, angular, irregular roads that made a lot of sense when their primary use was to move horses and cattle and then had to be adapted for cars, buses, bikes. They figured it out. Here in the U.S., we have figured out how to adapt a lot of our urban streetscapes in ways that are just smarter and better than how they were set up often in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think bigger picture, this will happen with the adoption of excellent rail options too. The way I talk about it is that if a Japanese citizen, or for that matter, Turkish or Italian citizen, can expect a certain high standard of reliable, fast rail service, why shouldn't an American citizen have access to that too? What they're doing in California is part of the work that's going on toward making that happen. People talk about first mover advantage. There's a first mover burden to do something totally new, especially when large infrastructure is at stake. And when you're in that mode, it creates more challenges. But in the end, we have to have a can-do spirit about this because it's important practically for people getting around, and it's important in terms of sustainability. And as you know, I serve under a famously pro-passenger rail president who loves to be known as Amtrak Joe, who quizzes me and my colleagues regularly about the status of passenger rail improvements around the country. High speed won't happen overnight, but it will happen in the U.S. I'm confident of it.
We are history's greatest emitter, the United States. So we are a big shareholder in what's happening around the planet. And paradoxically, some of history's lightest footprint populations, the people who have done the least to create this problem, are going to feel it most keenly, most intensely, most quickly. That is a recipe for a good justice conversation, but it's hard to make policy around it when the people who have done the most to create the problem are feeling it least and feel like they are burdened by creating the solutions most of all. I don't get a lot of people, when I interview people about this, feeling this keenly yet, except for people who are already sold. But there's a lot of skeptics in the United States who say, decarbonize, I have all these other problems. And this is like maybe the 19th or 20th on my list. It's the heart of your portfolio. Is it a tough sell even now when bad things are happening that we can point to and say, well, this is the kind of thing that's going to happen a lot?
Well, a couple things I think are changing that dynamic. The first is it's not just the perspective between one country and another in terms of how vulnerable they are to climate change, but between one generation and another. I think to previous generations or older generations serving now or leading now, in some corners, obviously not in this administration, but in some corners, there's an attitude that still seems to view this as a remote, esoteric, and maybe overblown concern. But if you're my age or younger, and I'm 41, you know that your life in very concrete and specific ways is being shaped and will continue to be shaped by the climate challenge. So there's a different kind of propulsion around getting something done. But also, another thing that's changing this is we are in a position, especially in transportation and infrastructure, to break the old false choice that says that it's either climate or jobs. So if you're in a paradigm that says that you have to sacrifice jobs in order to do the right thing on climate, of course that's a tough sell. But I have seen construction sites in places like DeSoto, Kansas, and Glendale, Kentucky, where factories for EV components are being built that are going to have thousands of jobs each. Many of them six-figure jobs, even if you don't have a college degree, that will be up and running next year, that will dwarf what I considered to be the enormous footprint of the old Studebaker factory that dominated the skyline of downtown South Bend as I was growing up. And these jobs are going to fuel communities, livelihoods, families, and create generational wealth. Whether we're talking about EVs or any number of industries associated with the future of transportation and clean energy more generally, there's enormous opportunity in that. Not only that, there's an imperative from a competitiveness perspective to make sure that America wins. It's part of why we're so energetic about this. China's leap into clean technologies, I don't think that reflects the Chinese regime being any more interested purely on green grounds than we are. I think it reflects a correct assessment of the economic strategic value of getting a step ahead in clean transportation and clean technologies. So to me, this is not a question of where do you rank sustainability and climate. Do you put it ahead of jobs and ahead of security or behind jobs and behind security? To me, this is security and this is jobs. And part of my job, I think, is to point out these extraordinary opportunities being created in the very same places that had been told that moving into sustainability would be a downside or a cost, to help illustrate the benefit and the opportunity that comes with it.
Next year, your boss is going to go back to the people, give them an argument about how the last 4 years have gone. When you write the DOT part of the pitch, what do you have to say about the recent past and the coming future?
Well, taking care to not be commenting on a campaign, but to say why I'm so proud to be part of this administration. We are in the midst of an extraordinarily productive time in U.S. government. And that can be a very difficult thing to keep focus on given the extraordinary obstacles and the terrible and I would argue unnecessary problems that are being associated with this default threat and the many areas in which we all know full well that Washington can be dysfunctional. And yet, if you look at the last couple of years, I actually think it is Ron Klain who put it best at his departure event. He talked about how this country under President Biden has passed the most significant economic legislation since FDR and the most meaningful infrastructure investments since Eisenhower, while delivering probably the second most significant change and improvement to healthcare since LBJ, and managing the biggest land war in Europe since the Truman years, while confronting the biggest public health crisis since Woodrow Wilson was president, all with the slimmest majority in Congress that a Democratic president has faced in the better part, I think, of a century. I can't put it any better than that. You look at what's been achieved, and there's obviously a long way to go. But bipartisan infrastructure legislation at a time when people didn't think you could have bipartisan anything in this town. A CHIPS Act that is helping us to reinvigorate American industry and as part of a broader course of action that has already delivered 800,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector alone since this president took office. Achievements that have eluded other presidents and other Congresses, and a long way to go. We have a lot to show for these 2 years and change, and when the clock gets to 4 years, that'll be even more true. And as the president said in his State of the Union address, we've got a lot more to do to finish the job, but we're well underway.
Secretary, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.